So Russia feels they have a stake in this because they feel they're fighting terrorism as much as anybody else. There's also Russian nationalism, assertiveness, and a Putin factor. Now, consider what's happened in Russia, consider what's happened in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon over the past, say, 14, 15 years. Who's the big winner? Is it Putin? Probably not. Who's come out ahead? How about Santa Claus here? The big geopolitical winner, no, that's not Santa Claus, that's Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And here he is with some of his Revolutionary Guard leaders. What's happening is sort of an arc of Iranian influence forming across the Middle East, not including the Kurds, by the way, but certainly Iraq's Shia-dominated government, Syria, certainly with Assad, an Iranian ally, parts of Lebanon that are actually controlled by Hezbollah. You think of terrorist groups as guys hiding in houses and coming out at night. They actually control territory in Lebanon. Now I'm going to briefly talk about Libya. Libya is really big. You could fit Texas about 4 times into Libya. It's about the size of Alaska. Came under control of Italy, actually, about 1911, kicking out the Ottoman Empire. And in 1969, Captain Muammar al-Gaddafi, soon to be Field Marshal Gaddafi, took power. There you can see him with the president of Italy. There's one of Gaddafi's bodyguards. Took power, a very quixotic, very strange leader, had his green book, dabbled with chemical weapons, WMD, gave those up, and then there was a bombing campaign supported by the U.S., but it was really the British Royal Air Force and the French that brought him to heel. And of course, in 2011, Gaddafi retired from public service permanently. So what do you have when you have a country that you had no civil society, no democratic tradition, no rule of law? Remember, I began by talking about rule of law. What do you have then? Well, of course, you have a civil war. And so you've got 2 competing governments supported by countries on the outside. The U.S. is not really taking sides in this one so much, but Turkey, Qatar on one side, the Tripoli side, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the Tobruk side, and different areas of the country. Again, you've got the so-called dignity people over here, the National Accord people. You've got the blue areas controlled by local groups. Tuaregs, those are the guys that wrap themselves like that and it sort of dyes their skin blue. Actually, I should have covered this blue instead of yellow, but I think you get the idea. In other words, you've got this going. The good thing about Libya, if I can say something good, is that just about everybody is Sunni. So you don't have a Sunni-Shia hatred angle to it, and they routinely have talks sponsored by the United Nations. They may actually be able to come together at some point. Concluding with some considerations for the West, and then we'll open it up for comments, questions. You've got 4 full-scale civil wars, 3 of, not counting insurgencies or terror, 3 of the 4 have very severe Sunni-Shia angles to them. The U.S. and Britain are very engaged in the region. In the last year, you've had airstrikes in no less than 8 Islamic countries around the region. And that's before we start counting the French. Special Operations Forces providing combat enabling. This is the U.S. Alone, about 10 or 15 countries. If you add in Britain, you get more. If you add in France, you get more. You add Germany, you get more. There's a lot of engagement. So I'd like to ask some questions. For the West, what is the smart response to a pugnacious Putin for all the things that Russia's trying to do around the world? And there are a lot of facets to this relationship. Remember, we're cooperating on some things, other things not. What are the interests of allies? If you're British, what are the interests of Britain's allies? How can they help? What is the role of Israel in the equation? What are the interests and what can long-term friends, such as His Majesty Abdullah II of Jordan, what can he do for you? What should we do for him? What are his limitations? What are his interests and potential contributions? What is the capability, there you see President Trump, to marshal local support, sort of local resources? And what are some of the priorities, challenges, and opportunities elsewhere? I think you've seen a lot of that on this cruise in the Far East, the Southeast Asia, and certainly with China. Military solutions. Military solutions can be very fast. They can be show resolve. They can sometimes be necessary. Problem is oftentimes targets resist, and other countries may not support you if you're flying into wherever you're flying into. And for those of you that have an opportunity to serve in the military, you know that the first thing that goes to pieces is upon contact with the enemy is the battle plan. Things never go the way you expect. So again, I would ask specifically, what should the West do? What is in our national interest? Not in their national interest, but what is the interest of the West? What will actually accomplish goals? What can we realistically afford? What can we sustain? Is there a viable exit strategy? Or are we going out there for the next 20 years? And where should our priorities lie? Is war always the best solution? Is war better as a last resort? Will diplomacy work? Is it a cheaper alternative? I'd like to call a 5-minute break. Please feel free to leave. Have a restroom break if you wish. Grab some coffee or tea. If you want, those of you that wish to come back in 5 minutes, I'll do a question and answer. Tomorrow, our Sea Day, I'll be back on alignment to the cruise, talk about Singapore and everything that is there. And with that, I'd like to say thank you so much. Have a wonderful day at sea, and then in Kuching this afternoon. Okay, good morning, and welcome to the Constellation Theater for the next installment in the Enrichment Lecture Series. This is the only talk that's not closely aligned to your itinerary. I've been talking about Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Borneo, and I will talk about Singapore. This is talking about places that are in conflict, and happily they're very far from us here in the South China Sea. The lecture will, of course, repeat on Channel 9 if you miss it or if you want to see it again. Now, noting, as I always give a disclaimer, I'm very proud of my time in the Navy and with the Department of State, but I'm not a government spokesman, which means I can give you an independent analysis of what's going on. And then also noting, again, I'm not taking sides on the Middle East borders where they should be or this side or the other. And I'm certainly not endorsing a religion, attacking a religion. I'm going to just try to lay things out how in neutral terms as best I can. Now, I just want to repeat a couple of things very briefly from the last talk so that we're all on the same page. Again, I'd like to quote President George W. Bush. Right after 9/11, he noted that the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. That's not what Islam is about. Islam is peace. Now this morning I'll walk you through, well, yesterday we talked about Islam in Southeast Asia and the differences between the Sunni and the Shia. Today I'll walk you through the 4 big civil wars that are going on in the Middle East, and using what I described yesterday in terms of Sunni Shia, I think that hopefully it'll give you a better way of understanding what is going on and what is likely to happen next. I won't try to talk about what happened yesterday or the day before, because you've got the internet, you've got TV, you've got newspapers, things like that, but rather what is going on behind the scenes or in the background that people in the Middle East know. Some people would say know only too well. So that you can understand sort of like, why are they fighting? Okay, now yesterday I talked about Southeast Asia, and I talked about the Sunni and Shia. Remember, both Sunni and Shia would all agree that there's no God but God, Muhammad is the messenger of God. They would agree on the Quran, the 5 pillars of Islam. Since 632 AD, they've disagreed as who should lead the Muslims, and the Sunni have developed in the Arab world and have been more outward. The Shia have developed mainly in Persia, that is present-day Iran, although there are Shia Arabs as well. Different prophetic traditions. Sunni is the much larger branch of Islam, outnumbers the Shia 3 to 1, maybe even 9 to 1. And then the leading states of the Shia are Iran and Iraq. The leading states of the Sunni, besides, well, Malaysia's one, Indonesia, of course, but of course Saudi Arabia, Egypt, India, Pakistan. And so you see the Sunni world, marked in green, is basically outward and then out to the far east. The Shia world is sort of centered right here, with 5 Shia majority countries in the world: Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, and probably Lebanon as well. Conflicts in the Southeast Asia involving Islam. There are about 5 or 6, except for the one in Rakhine, which has really taken off in the past year. They've been long, simmering local insurgencies. They were around 5 or 10 years ago. They probably will be 5 or 10 years from now. They're very bad for the local people involvement, but it's not going to really affect anything much larger. Rakhine, though, has the potential for really spinning out of control. Okay, let's talk about the 4 civil wars. Now, something I would like to emphasize is most of the Middle East is calm. Most people live their lives in peace, harmony. This is in the Nile Valley, a photo that my daughter took. And most of the Middle East is safe for Americans and people like us. That doesn't mean there aren't some places that are dangerous, but most of the Middle East is perfectly fine. Now, one of the things that's driving all of this, besides changes in the world in many ways, in media and everything, and the economy, the world is sped up during your lifetimes. And part of this phenomenon is the incredible increase in population. Now, if any of you have been to Egypt, and for example, if you went on a cruise, and you stop at Hurghada and you take the bus across the desert to the Nile Valley to go to the Valley of the Kings, I know some of you have done that, and you're driving across Egypt, and until you get to the Nile Valley, most of the way, you see rocks and sand, and then you see some more sand and rocks. In other words, not a blade of grass is growing. These are countries that can't support large numbers of people. But in recent years, look at how the population in Egypt has basically doubled. Yemen, the poorest country in the Arab world, is 2.5 times, it's almost triple what it was in 1980. Syria has gone way up as well. The carrying capacity of the land for producing food, jobs, fresh water, and handling sewage and trash, it can't really handle it. And that leads, of course, more and more people squabbling over fewer resources. They're going to fight. Now, that doesn't excuse what's going on, but it's an explanation. So right now you've got 4 civil wars going on: Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. In some ways, and I'll give you the arguments in favor or against, there's some serious proxy conflicts between the Sunni world and the Shia world, namely, in some cases, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, the 2 big giants. Battles between religious and nominally secular, for example, in Libya, and the sectarian rift that is becoming more and more acute. Now, we're not counting insurgencies, civil unrest, terrorists, that sort of thing. Those are important, of course, but we're looking at full-scale civil wars where you can actually look at maps and see where different sides are, and I'll show you some of those maps in Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And some of this, you could argue, is between the leader of the Sunni world, or at least the aspirational leader of the Sunni world. Not all Arabs, not all Sunnis would agree, but Saudi Arabia versus Iran, which sees itself as the custodian of the flame of Shia Islam. And I'll explain this more in more detail in a minute, but just so you have an idea of where I'm going with this. This looks complicated, like a spider web, but it really isn't. If you look at this side of the diagram as being Iraq, and on this side of the yellow dotted line, that's Syria. Some of the area in the middle is getting smaller and smaller, held by ISIS. And then you have Iran supporting the Iraqi government, Kurds on both sides of the border, and this supporting the Syrian government. Russia supporting the Syrian government, they're all against ISIS, of course. Turkey, they sort of have been becoming more assertive, helping Syrian rebels against the Kurds, the Saudis helping Syrian rebels and Iraqi Sunnis, the U.S. supporting Kurds, the Iraqi government, Syrian rebels, and Iraqi Sunnis. So everybody has picked their sides. Now we're going to unexplain all that in a minute. One thing to bear in mind is a big cause of all the problems is, I can sum it up with one word. I mean, you see the list that I'm putting on the screen there. Freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, status of women and girls, on down. It's right here. Lack of rule of law. When you have a society under population pressure, you have dictatorial governments that really don't follow their own laws, you get the situation of strife, poverty, conflict, and suffering. Now let's look at Yemen, because Yemen is a really easy one to understand if you look at it through the prism of Sunni versus Shia. Now, Yemen is a very dry, dusty place. Probably the poorest place in the Arab world, poorer than most places in Africa. And if you look at all the social indicators of GDP, of life expectancy, like about 62, so if I was a Yemeni, I would be dead by now. Access to electricity, water, infant mortality. Yemen is off the charts in every bad indicator, if you have eyes good enough to read the little numbers I put there. This is a really poor country, always has been. Politically, it's been sort of unstable. In fact, there used to be two Yemens, North Yemen and South Yemen. And in North Yemen, which is sort of has been the leader of everything, after a couple of presidents had been assassinated, President Ali Abdullah Saleh took office. And, you know, he was a brave man to assume the presidency, because I mentioned his two predecessors had been whacked. And he's been very resilient in office. He's been very dedicated to public service. In fact, he was so determined to retain the presidency that one of the first things he did, about 4 weeks later, was have 30 officers who he thought might be plotting against him arrested and shot without trial. Such was his dedication to remaining in office. He had a lot of people. He played politics for keeps. I first went to Yemen in 1978. He was newly in power. He was only lieutenant colonel at the time, firmly in control. I never met him. I was working with other people. But he cast a shadow over the whole country. He was soon promoted, of course, from lieutenant colonel. And he stayed in office from 1978 to 2012. That's a long time, being very resilient in that part of the world, considering the history of his country. Here's a picture of him as he's starting to age. He is very pragmatic, very moderate, very corrupt, very venal. The perfect guy for us to do business with. And he turned out to be a great partner for going after Al-Qaeda. Now, he played us against them. He would sort of play up the threat of Al-Qaeda, and then in exchange for assistance and things like that, he played us, we played them. When I say us, I don't mean just the U.S. I mean the whole Western world, including Britain, Canada, Australia, and the rest. Now, I promised you I'd explain it through the current price problems through the Shia-Sunni prism. At the end of the Cold War, South Yemen, which is this area down here, closely allied to the Soviet Union. North Yemen, which is sort of a wild, woolly tribal place, which run by Colonel Saleh, soon General Saleh, of course, they united. Cold War over, North and South united. One country became Yemen, but you can see the huge area of Yemen that is Shia, about 40% of the country. Now the red area down here is Sunni. The Wahhabi is marked in green. That's a form of Sunni Islam, very strict and everything like that. The Ibadis over here in Oman, very moderate. I've talked about them yesterday. The key point is large numbers of Shia concentrated geographically in one part of Yemen. So Saleh's in power, and the Arab Spring rolls around. The Arab Spring, the pressure from the outside world, the pressure within Yemen, the expectations, it made his rule untenable. He'd been in office a long time, a real public servant, so to speak. he resigned the presidency and then openly allied with the Houthis. Said, everybody that supports me, I'm resigning the presidency, I'm going to support the Houthis. Who are the Houthis? The Houthis were rebels, Shia from the north. So it's crazy. Only in Yemen could the president resign and then ally with rebels coming in from the outside. And this led to the current civil war. Now the Houthis, led by a guy whose name is al-Houthi, surprise, they came down from the north, sort of ragtag, but very ruthless. They didn't even have a good flag. They would put up these sort of banners right here. And there you see some Houthi units, and they quickly swept through the north and the center part of the country, sometimes fighting, sometimes not. They had read their Sun Tzu, the Art of War, trying to take power without fighting, coming in. And they had an interesting philosophy. For those of you that don't read Arabic, it says, God is great, death to America, death to Israel, a curse upon the Jews, and victory Islam. They do not like us. They do not like you. But that was their going philosophy. So, and the U.S. Embassy, needless to say, had to close, which was in their area. Now, here's what the country looks like right now. You've got the rump government, which I'm calling the government, but in many ways the Houthis are the government now. The Hadi government down to the south. You've got large areas of the country more or less controlled by Al-Qaeda. Now everybody knows that Al-Qaeda is a terrorist group and does not seek to control territory. Well, they're definitely a terrorist group, but they do actually control some territory in South Yemen. That's one reason why Britain and the U.S. from time to time do airstrikes in some of these parts of the country against Al-Qaeda. Now, the Hadi government would say no, they don't, but they really do. Now, the Hadi government and the Houthis, they have friends. Now remember, Al-Qaeda is Sunni, totally Sunni. There's probably not a single open Shia member of Al-Qaeda, ditto with ISIS. So you got the Shia up here, the Sunni down here, and who's going to support the Houthis? Who are their natural allies? Who would they turn to? Remember the map I showed you of the Middle East, who is where, and who would naturally support these fellows? Okay, the Hadis are being supported big time by the most wealthy and powerful countries in the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Air support, guns, lots of Emirati troops even. Who would support the Shia Houthi rebels? Iran, Syria. Groups like Hezbollah, which is a terrorist group, but they're Shia out of Islam. They're sort of the shock troops sometimes, and they're helping them as well. And then, since you're talking about Iran and Syria, by extension, you get some support from Russia, North Korea, and that long line. Now, the U.S. is a big supporter of Saudi Arabia, and so the U.S. and the West, by extension, are supporting the people in the South to some extent. So, Yemen is a sort of an easy conflict to understand. It's the Sunnis versus the Shia, or the Iranians supporting the Houthis, the Saudis supporting the Hadi government in the south and in the west. So you have these different conflicts around the area, really since 1979, which is the date of the Iranian Revolution, but in many ways it really has intensified in the last couple of years. It's really gotten more and more. So having a more complete list of allies of the Houthis, you can see you have everybody from Iran to Russia and Hezbollah. Opponents of the Houthis, certainly Saudi Arabia, the UAE, as well as people we don't like so much, such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, let's finish the story. Ex-President Ali Abdullah, who had supported the Houthis. Now, he made a mistake. You don't do this in the Middle East. And as somebody who plays politics, I should say, played politics for keeps, President Saleh, former President Saleh, should have known better. He switched sides. He switched sides. No, switching sides is okay, but he switched sides when in Sana'a, a city basically controlled by the Houthis. Now he had his guys around him, but how did the Houthis react? They reacted badly. So they basically went to his part of town, his house, and they killed him. very simple. He should have known it was coming. And so that has exacerbated the crisis. They've got a food crisis in Yemen. See, in Yemen, what you do, because you're talking Sunni versus Shia, and a lot of the one side doesn't think the others are real Muslims. I mean, they are. They're real people, if nothing else. But they look upon them in very inhumane terms. So food is a weapon in Yemen. It's a very effective weapon. If people are malnourished, starving, hungry, they can't fight as well. So you've got, and these numbers are probably low. I didn't revise them because I don't trust the new statistics coming out. But the statistics are 2 million children are malnourished, 500,000 are at risk of death, many more adults. We're talking about, the latest statistics I saw was a quarter of the country. The quarter is about 25 million people. So you've got about 6 million people at severe food risk. Over half the population, 10, 12 million people with severe food insecurity. I mean, numbers that are too big for me to confidently put on a slide. But in other words, we're talking real humanitarian crisis. So that's what's happening in Yemen. Awful place. ISIS in Iraq. Again, let's look at the situation in Iraq. Sunni versus Shia. Remember, I mentioned Iraq is a Shia majority state. Shia are about 60%. That's clearly a majority. The Sunnis controlled Iraq since World War I. The British had a mandate for Iraq. They installed Hashemite kings, the same families in Jordan. They installed them in Iraq. And they ruled the country quite successfully for some 20 years until 1958. And that was when Saddam Hussein and his friends took power, also a Sunni. They murdered the king, they murdered his family, they murdered all the household staff in the palace. They did not play around either. His rule was brutal by any standard. Maybe he needed that in a place like Iraq. His regime was dominated by Sunnis. This is a country, remember, which is majority Shia. And they know Saddam is a Sunni. Well, he didn't make a big thing of it, but he made sure of that Sunnis dominated, particularly people from his tribe in Tikrit. Now, we're going to fast forward 2003. The U.S.-led invasion overthrew Saddam, and the majority Shia took power. They began to take revenge. Nouri al-Maliki became the prime minister, burned bridges to the Sunnis, excluded Sunnis from the government. He was democratically elected, but guess what? He did not rule democratically. And did I mention corrupt? So if you look at Iraq to understand the problem, see, the Shia tend to live down here in the south. Sunni, everybody lives in Baghdad. Sunni tend to live in the north and the west. And then the Kurds, which are distinct, and I'll talk about them more in a couple of minutes. The Kurds, who are different from Arab Sunni, live in the north and the northeast. So you had geographic divisions. So you got the Shia, who are about 60%, the Sunni about almost 1 in 5, Arabic Sunni, and then the Kurds, who are Sunni, but they speak a different language. They speak Kurdish, and there are Kurds on the other side of the border that they relate to. And then you've got 3 or 4%, the number's getting smaller, of Christians, Jews, Yazidis, Turkmens, Zoroastrians, etc. It's getting very hard to be a minority in Iraq. So under Maliki, life is becoming miserable, corrupt. The government steals everything, and you don't have a way forward. So how were the Sunni to react? Now, I never would defend ISIS, not for one moment, not what they did, not their, but if you understand, it's important to understand how a group as horrible as ISIS could ever get any support. And they would argue that they were pushed into a corner by the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. No democratic alternatives, corruption, no economic alternatives for young men. The Saudis had always espoused a hardline form of Islam. ISIS gave people a sense of identity. The normal geopolitical order within the Middle East was turned upside down. And this was just sort of the toxic atmosphere. in which something like ISIS could grow. And so you had these different groups. You had Al-Qaeda,